This 1886 portrait of a midwife holding a newborn looks caring at first until you notice the register. It seemed like a gentle image of early medical care. A woman cradling a baby, her face soft with what anyone would assume was compassion. But one researcher noticed what was sitting on the table next to her, and that single detail revealed a system so calculated and coldly efficient that it had remained hidden in plain sight for over a century. Naomi Jeff had been cataloging photographs for the Low Country Historical Consortium in Charleston, South Carolina, for 11 years. She had gone through thousands of images from estate sales, church basements, and private collections. Pictures of plantation families, Confederate officers' visits, and cabinet cards marking weddings or funerals blurred together after a while into the same sepia sameness. But this one made her pause. The photograph had come in a lot purchased from a foreclosed home in rural Colleton County. Mixed in with water-damaged linens, rusted farming tools, and boxes of moth-eaten fabric, there was a small wooden chest. Inside were 43 photographs, most ordinary family portraits from the late 19th century. But one, wrapped in wax paper, was different. It showed a woman in her 50s seated in a tall wooden chair. She wore a dark dress with a white apron and her silver hair pulled back under a cotton cap. In her arms lay a newborn, tightly swaddled in pale cloth. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Her right hand supported the baby's head with clear care. The infant's eyes were closed, its tiny face peaceful. At first glance, it looked like hundreds of other portraits Naomi had seen of midwives, wet nurses, or caretakers, images meant to show competence and tenderness. But then she noticed the table beside the chair. There, at the edge of the frame, sat a leather-bound register. It was open, filled with columns of handwritten entries. The woman's left hand, the one not holding the baby, rested on the table, fingers extended toward the register as if it mattered as much as the child. Naomi adjusted her magnifying lamp and leaned closer. The infant was black, the midwife white, and the more Naomi studied the photo, the more deliberate it seemed. The register wasn't an accident in the frame. It had been placed there on purpose. It was part of the portrait's meaning. She turned the photograph over. In faded pencil were 3 words: Mrs. Galt, Walterboro. Naomi set the image down and stared at it. She had seen enough photos from that era to know that images of white women holding black infants were almost always about power, not care. But the register was unusual. She had never seen one included so intentionally in a portrait. Whatever it recorded, someone had wanted it seen. Someone had wanted it remembered. She could have filed the photo and moved on, but something about the woman's expression unsettled her. There was no warmth in those eyes. Only patience and certainty, the look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Naomi decided she needed to know what Mrs. G had been recording. She hadn't planned to become an archivist. She started as a high school history teacher in Columbia, spending summers volunteering at local historical societies. After 15 years in the classroom, she took a position at the consortium, drawn by the promise of quieter work and handling primary sources instead of just teaching from them. She had a reputation for meticulousness. Colleagues joked she could date a photo by the buttons on a coat, but it wasn't just skill that made her good at her job, it was an ethical stubbornness. She believed archives were not neutral. Every photograph that survived had been chosen, preserved, and interpreted by someone. The people in those photographs, especially those with no say in how they were depicted, deserved their stories told accurately, even when the truth was uncomfortable. She had handled difficult images before, photographs of enslaved people posed as property, lynching postcards sent like souvenirs, convict laborers in chains. Each required care, context, and the willingness to look past the surface. But this photo of Mrs. Galt felt different. It wasn't openly violent. It wasn't obviously degrading. It presented itself as something gentle, which Naomi thought could make it more dangerous. She began with the inscription, Mrs. G, Walterboro. Walterboro was a small town in Colleton County, about 50 miles west of Charleston. In 1886, it was a rural community surrounded by cotton and rice plantations. many still run by the same white families who had owned them before the war, using tenant farming and sharecropping to keep black workers in debt. If Mrs. G was a midwife there, she likely served both white and black families. That was common. What was less common was a formal portrait commemorating the work. Naomi spent several days searching for Mrs. Galt in records. City directories from the 1880s listed a Margaret Galt, widow of Thomas Galt, living on Richmond Street. The 1880 census showed 2 adult daughters and 1 domestic servant, a black woman named Celia, aged 32. By 1890, most census records had been destroyed by fire. Naomi found Margaret G's death notice in the Colleton Press from 1901, describing her as a beloved community figure who had assisted in the delivery of hundreds of the county's children over 4 decades. Hundreds of children. 4 decades. Naomi thought about the register in the photograph. If Margaret G kept detailed records, they might still exist somewhere. They might explain why she included the book in her portrait and reveal exactly what she was documenting. She contacted the Colleton County Historical Society to ask if they had materials related to Margaret Galt or midwifery practices. A week later, they replied. They didn't have Margaret G. Galt's records specifically, but had documents from the Colleton County Orphans Court from 1866 to 1895. Among them were references to a Mrs. M.G. serving as a witness in apprenticeship proceedings. Naomi requested copies of every document that mentioned her name. Dr. Leonard Price, a legal historian at the University of South Carolina who specialized in post-emancipation labor systems, had worked with Naomi before on a project about turpentine workers in the 1890s. She sent him the photo and a summary of her findings. Within 2 days, he replied, "This is exactly the kind of image I've been looking for." He explained that the apprenticeship system in South Carolina was a tool to effectively re-enslave black children after emancipation, and midwives were often central to how it worked. After the Civil War, Southern states passed black codes controlling the movement and labor of formerly enslaved people. One provision allowed courts to apprentice black children to white masters if parents were deemed unable to support them. The rules for inability were deliberately vague. Families could lose their children simply for being poor, accused of neglect, or refusing an unfair contract. In theory, apprenticeships provided training and welfare. In practice, it extracted unpaid labor. Children as young as 2 could be bound to white employers until adulthood, receiving no wages, unable to leave, and punished for disobedience. Midwives were important because they often first knew when a black child was born. Dr. Price wrote, "If a midwife supported the apprenticeship system or was paid to report births, she could give courts and planters the information needed to claim children before families could protect them." Naomi looked at the photograph again, the register, the careful positioning, the infant held not as a patient, but as a product. She drove to Columbia to meet Dr. Price. He showed her apprenticeship indentures from the period, legal documents binding black children to white employers for 10, 15, or even 20 years. Many listed the person who reported the child's birth or identified the family as indigent. In several cases from Colleton County, the name was M.G. She wasn't just delivering babies, she was supplying them. The Colleton County Courthouse still held orphan court records, moved to climate-controlled storage in the 1990s. Naomi arranged a visit with the county archivist, Harold Simmons, who warned that the files were incomplete. Many lost, damaged, or destroyed. What remained was enough. Naomi spent 3 days in storage, working through boxes of yellowed, moldy papers. She found 74 apprenticeship indentures between 1866 and 1890, listing Margaret G. as a witness, informant, or recommending party. 74 children, some infants, some toddlers, all black. The indentures followed a standard format, naming the child, parents if known, the master, and the terms. Most terms were the same. The child would serve until age 21, receive food, clothing, and instruction in housework, but no wages, no education, no right to visit family, In exchange, the master promised moral guidance and to return the child in good health at the end of the term. What struck Naomi most was how soon after birth many of these apprenticeships began. One indenture dated March 1871 bound a child named Samuel to a planter named Josiah Ravenel. Samuel was just 6 weeks old. His mother, listed as Hattie Freedwoman, had been declared unable to care for him by a justice of the peace. The informant who reported Hattie's situation was Margaret Galt. Another indenture from 1879 bound twin girls, Esther and Ruth, to a family named Colcock. They were 3 months old. Their mother had died in childbirth. Margaret Galt had attended the birth and recommended that the girls be placed in a Christian home rather than remain with their father, described as a field hand with unsteady habits. Naomi photographed every document she could find. She built a spreadsheet track. Names, dates, ages, and outcomes. When she mapped the apprentice children against the families who received them, a clear pattern appeared. The same dozen white families kept showing up as masters. Many were the same families who had owned the largest plantations in Colleton County before the war. They were using the apprenticeship system to rebuild their labor force, one child at a time, and Margaret Galt was their supplier. Harold Simmons watched Naomi work with growing unease. He had known these records existed, but had never examined them closely. When she showed him the pattern, he sat down heavily and rubbed his eyes. "We've had researchers come through before," he said, looking at land records and tax rolls. "Nobody ever asked about the orphans' court." "Nobody wanted to know," Naomi said. He nodded slowly. "I suppose that's right." Naomi needed to understand how the community had experienced this system. The court records told her what happened legally, but they didn't show how black families lived under it. For that, she turned to a different kind of archive. The Avery Research Center in Charleston held one of the South's most important collections of African American history. Among their holdings were oral histories recorded in the 1930s by the Federal Writers Project, part of the same initiative that produced the famous slave narratives. Naomi requested access to interviews conducted with elderly black residents of Colleton County. She found what she was looking for in a transcript dated November 1937. The interviewee was a woman named Della Ravenel, then 82 years old. She had been born into slavery on a rice plantation near Walterboro in 1855. After emancipation, her family remained in the area as sharecroppers. The interviewer asked about her children. "I had 7 live babies," Della said. "Kept 3. The others the white lady took them." The interviewer asked her to explain. "The midwife, Mrs. G, she come when I had my babies. She nice at first, but then she tell the courthouse I too poor, too sick, too something, and the judge say my children got to go work for Mr. Colcock or Mr. Ravenel or whoever she picked out. I cry, I beg, don't do no good, they just take them. My own children working in the fields like I did when I was coming up, like nothing changed at all." The interviewer asked if she ever saw those children again. "Sometimes from far off they working. I'm working, can't talk, can't stop. If you stop, you get trouble. So you just look, keep going, and try not to think about it. But you always thinking about it every day." Naomi read the transcript 3 times. Then she closed the folder and sat in silence. She thought about the photograph of Margaret Galt, the calm expression, the hand resting possessively near the register. She had delivered Della Ravenel's children. She had held them in her arms like the infant in the portrait, then handed them over to be bound to the same white families who had once enslaved their parents. The register wasn't a record of care. It was an inventory. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a historian of black motherhood and reproductive labor at Spelman College, had written about wet nursing and the forced separation of enslaved families. When Naomi sent her the photograph and research, the response was immediate. "This is documentation of reproductive extraction." Dr. Carter wrote, "Margaret G. positioned herself as a caretaker, but her actual role was to identify black children who could be removed from their families and transferred to white households as laborers. The register in the photograph is her ledger of that extraction. She is showing it to the camera because she is proud of it. She sees it as proof of her value to the community, the white community benefiting from her services." Dr. Carter agreed to collaborate on a paper contextualizing the photograph within the broader history of post-emancipation labor exploitation. But she also warned Naomi that publishing this research would be controversial. These families still exist. The Ravenels, the Colcocks, and others who appear in those indentures. Some are still in South Carolina. Some are donors to historical institutions. Some sit on boards. Telling this story means telling them their family wealth was built on child labor that was functionally slavery. They won't thank you for it, Naomi understood. But she also knew Della Ravenel's descendants still existed and had a right to know what happened to their family. The Low Country Historical Consortium held a meeting to discuss Naomi's findings. 12 people sat around a table: the executive director, the board chair, the development officer, several curators, and 2 outside advisors. Naomi presented her research methodically, showing the photograph, court records, oral history, and the pattern linking Margaret G. to the apprenticeship of black children. The room was silent when she finished. Then the questions began. The development officer spoke first. Several of the families you've named are current donors. The Ravenel Foundation gave us $50,000 last year for the garden restoration project. If we publish this, they may withdraw support. The board chair nodded. And the Colcocks have been members since the organization's founding. Their name is on the reading room. Naomi had expected this. I understand the concern, she said, but these records are public. Anyone with access to the Colleton County archives could find what I found. The question isn't whether this information will come out. The question is whether we want to be the ones to tell the truth, or wait until someone else does, and then have to explain why we stayed silent. The executive director, Patricia Holmes, leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing? A small exhibition, Naomi said, centered on this photograph. We explain who Margaret G. was, what the apprenticeship system was, and how this image has been misread for over a century. We include the voices of people harmed. This is not ancient history. The last children bound under these indentures would have been released in the 1900s or 1910s. There are people alive today whose grandparents were taken from their families through this system. The room divided. Some argued for caution, private conversations with families before a public statement. Others, including 2 curators, supported Naomi. The debate went on nearly an hour. Finally, Patricia Holmes spoke. Our mission is to preserve and interpret the Low Country's history, all of it, not just the parts that make donors comfortable. Naomi has done what we hired her to do. She found a hidden story and documented it rigorously. If we suppress it because we fear losing money, we are no different from those who destroyed these records. She looked around. We will proceed with the exhibition and inform families in advance as a courtesy, but we will not ask their permission. The exhibition opened 6 months later. It occupied a single room, centered on an enlarged reproduction of the photograph. A panel explained who Margaret Galt was and what her register likely contained. Display cases held copies of the apprenticeship indentures with masters' names visible. An audio station played an excerpt from Della Ravenel's oral history, her voice crackling across decades. Naomi worked with a genealogist to trace descendants of some apprentice children. 3 families agreed to participate. One, Lorraine Middleton from North Charleston, was the great-granddaughter of Samuel, the infant bound to Josiah Ravenel at 6 weeks old. She stood in front of the photograph on opening night. I always knew something happened to my family, she said. My grandmother said we had been scattered, that pieces of us were taken and never returned. She didn't know the details, only the feeling that something was missing. She paused, looking at Margaret Galt's image. Now I know what was missing. It was us, our children, our labor, our right to raise our families. It wasn't taken by accident. It was on purpose by people who thought they had the right. People who wrote it down in registers, filed it in courthouses, and called it law. The exhibition drew more attention than expected. Regional newspapers covered it. A national magazine ran a feature. Historians requested copies of the research. Dr. Price used the Colleton County records as a case study in a book on post-emancipation labor exploitation. Dr. Carter included the photograph in a traveling exhibition on Black motherhood. The Ravenel Foundation withdrew funding. The Colcocks resigned their membership. Local politicians criticized the consortium for politically motivated historical revisionism. But new donations more than replace what was lost, and museum attendance rose 30% in the year after the exhibition opened. Naomi continued cataloging photographs with renewed attention to overlooked details. She developed a workshop for other archivists, teaching how to identify images with hidden evidence of exploitation. She emphasized that the surface of a photograph is never the whole story. The edges, the background objects, the positioning of hands and bodies all carry meaning. Every image is an argument, she told her students. It shows what the photographer wanted you to see. Your job is to ask what they didn't want you to see. Sometimes the answer is right there in the picture. The photograph of Margaret Galt now hangs in the consortium's permanent collection, with a label explaining its full history. Visitors pause, studying the details Naomi first noticed: the swaddled infant, the register on the table, the woman's calm, certain expression. Some ask why Margaret G. wanted to be remembered this way. Naomi believes the answer is she saw nothing wrong with it. In her mind, she was providing a service, ensuring children born to poor Black families would be cared for by respectable white households. She was maintaining order after emancipation. She was proud of it. The register was proof of a job well done. What she could not imagine was that someone over a century later would see the same image differently. Not a caretaker, but a broker. Not a ledger of services rendered, but an inventory of stolen children. Beneath the silence of the photograph, the voices of mothers like Della Ravenel cry out for babies they never kept. That is the power of photographs. They preserve what was intended and what was hidden. Sometimes the most ordinary images are evidence of the most extraordinary crimes. Thousands of photographs like this exist in Southern archives. White women holding Black children, families posed with servants, homes built on unpaid labor. Most have never been examined closely. Most are displayed without context as quaint relics. But every one is a document, preserving information someone chose to keep. Everyone waits for someone to look closely enough to see what has been hiding in plain sight. The question isn't whether these stories exist. The question is whether we are willing to look and, once found, tell the truth.